The most evil experiments conducted on live humans. No one is safe from the claws of the government if they decide to use the lives of the people as test subjects for their obsessive domination. Appearing in sheep clothing, millions have lost their lives over the century to causes unknown to them. Some subjected to atrocities that no one could bear because they were prisoners of war, while others, because of sheer ignorance, died in moribund. Take a look at the most horrifying experiment done to humans by humans. Number 9. Nazi. The Jews and Soviet prisoners were mostly the ones at the test sites of the Nazis' inhumane experiments. Before and during World War II, Nazi Germany was notorious for being ruthless. From finding out how the Russians had superior resistance to cold, to testing how their soldiers could deal with high altitudes, all these came with death, and no one, not even the ones that survived the experiment, was spared. The Air Force of the Nazis was called the Luftwaffe. Seeing how their armies could barely cope with the cold weather when they attacked Russia, they decided to go on a spree of more than 350 experiments at Dachau and Auschwitz using the captured Russian troops. More than 100 people died from the hypothermia experiment. Still at the Dachau camp in 1942, a German doctor, Sigmund Racher, used 200 captives as lab rats to test whether German pilots could eject from high altitudes without issue. So a low-pressure chamber was made to simulate an altitude of 66,000 feet. 80 of the 200 subjects died in the chamber, and the remaining who survived met their end in the hands of the Nazis. Number 8. Unit 731. As the Nazis conducted their tests, the Japanese didn't relent on theirs. Every nation was desperately looking for the next breakthrough in science and going by any means to get the solution they sought. Unit 731 was the center of all chemical and biological warfare research. Presided over by a combat medic officer, General Shiro Ishii, and generously funded by the Japanese government for 9 years. No captive who entered Unit 731 came out alive, although the exact number of people who died from the brutal experiments is unknown. The general consensus is that there are more than 3,000. So it could be said that more than 300 people died each year for 9 years in Unit 731. Some prisoners were infected with venereal diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea and left untreated to watch their effects. Others were also subjected to vivisection, and their organs were harvested without anesthesia. In the bioweapons section, prisoners were subjected to cholera, bubonic plague, smallpox, and several diseases used in the creation of flea and bacilli bombs. These bombs were used to kill more than 400,000 Chinese. Number 7. Indigenous Canada. In the early 1900s, down to the mid-1900s, the beautiful country of Canada melted one of the most brutal experiments on not prisoners of war, men, or women. No, the Canadian government did it on children. First, it was in 1933, when 600 native children from Guatemala and Saskatchewan were placed in a trial to test a tuberculosis vaccine. No parental consent was sought for these native children, and more than 100 children, both from the control and treatment groups, died from gastroenteritis and pneumonia because of the depletable living conditions of the children. Also, between 1942 and 1952, malnourished children from 6 schools were used without the consent of their parents to determine if the combination of certain supplements could result in more problems. Knowing the reason for the malnutrition was a lack of nutrition, the researchers still didn't treat them, but were more focused on the result of the experiment. The Department of Indian Affairs of Canada didn't care for the well-being of the children. Many died, while others had anemia, cavities, and gingivitis. Number 6. Guatemala. One of the 3 barbaric crimes committed by the United States I am going to be revealing is the Guatemala syphilis experiment. Due to the widespread of syphilis in the army and the ferociousness of World War II, the need to find a permanent cure was imminent. So leading the charge, John Charles Cutler and his fellow doctors infected 5,000 people, with 600 of them soldiers. while the rest were various disadvantaged people in society. Without their consent, these mental hospital inmates, prisoners, and SEQ workers were all subjected to syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid exposure. In Guatemala's National Mental Hospital alone, up to 1,500 patients were injected with these diseases. No one knew about the science crimes in Guatemala. All were covered up as syphilis inoculation. Not until Susan Reverby from Wellesley College, who was doing research on another worse syphilis experiment, did she find out the lies told to the Guatemalan government. This stirred a series of apologies from Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. Number 5. The Cell. This was the poison laboratory of the Soviet Secret Services, established 103 years ago. The main purpose of this lab was to test and identify a tasteless, odorless chemical that cannot be detected even when an autopsy is done on the victim. To accomplish this task, prisoners of war were used for this experiment. Each candidate picked for the experiment was given a food or drink laced with mustard gas, cyanide, ricin, and others. Survivors of the cell who witnessed these chemicals in play say the victims experience weakness, followed by a calm demeanor, then slowly slip away to death within 15 minutes. Marianovsky, who was in charge of the cell, made sure that the poison was tested on various age and physical conditions of people to see the effect of the poison. Many notable and top-ranked individuals in and outside Russia met their end in the hands of the silent, lethal poisons experimented in the cell, although the number of people that died during the experiments is unknown. It is without doubt that their end was filled with bitterness. Number 4. UK crimes. When you thought royalty were free from the wicked experiments melted on humans, a declassified document from the shelves of the National Archives has proven you totally wrong. During the 20th century, more than 20,000 British soldiers were subjected to testing the effects of mustard gas. Indian servicemen were also among those tested. It's been made a secret if these tests were a voluntary, involuntary, or disguised action. But in 1950, Ronald Medician, a member of the Royal Air Force who thought he volunteered for the testing of the common cold cure, died. This was because he was exposed to 200 mg of a chemical weapon called sarin. It took the British High Court 54 years after the incident to rule the wicked act of the armed forces unlawful, also without the consent of the people. Of course, who would agree to be exposed to ill health? The Ministry of Defense felt that they were doing the people of the UK a favor by making them ready for a possible Soviet Union biological attack by dispersing through airplanes chemicals, microorganisms, and zinc cadmium sulfide. You could say the United Kingdom had some sympathy compared to the United States, which nearly caused the genocide of a race. Number 3. Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Susan Reverby from Wellesley College discovered the Guatemala experiment when she was making her findings on this experiment. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments, regarded as the most infamous biomedical research study in US history, the 40-year syphilis study was built on a vile hidden agenda unknown to the participants. The 600 participants who took part in this exercise were from Macon County, Alabama. 399 of them had syphilis, while 201 didn't. Initially, they were told it would only last 6 months, and for volunteering, they would be given free medical care. All were lies, because the doctors were eager to understand the disease. Penicillin, which was the known antibiotic for its treatment, wasn't administered to the men. Even after several concerns about the ethics of the experiment, the CDC stood firm that the experiment should continue until all 399 African-American men who had syphilis died. It was after 100 people had died that this brutal experiment made its way to the front page of the New York Times. This made the CDC and PHS halt the experiment, but the damage was already done and the act unforgiven. Number 2. Project MKUltra. The third US brutal experiment was the CIA's mind control program that never came to light until it was halted. Aside from the military, more than 80 research institutions were used as sites for these illegal activities. Disguised using a front organization, the CIA used several methods to manipulate the mental and brain functions of the subject. The aim was to devise a means to conduct interrogation and force confession through psychological torture and brainwashing. To do these, the CIA needed to develop procedures and identify the drugs that could make the victim do their bidding. So without the consent of the victim, they administered high doses of LSD and other psychoactive drugs. Not only that, the subjects were exposed to hypnosis, abuse, isolation, and various forms of torture. It was not until 2 years after the program ended that it was exposed. By then, the CIA director, Richard Helms, had ordered the destruction of most of the project documents, covering their track on the amount of death linked to this experiment, and the only one that was covered as a suicide case. Number 1. Zimbabweans. This time, US companies were the culprits. They decided to take the testing to Zimbabwe as the knight in shining armor to save the Zimbabweans women from transmitting HIV/AIDS to their newborns. The NIH and CDC collaborated to test over 17,000 women. They were meant to give each woman the drug AZT. Rather, only half were given the drug, while the remaining half were given a placebo. Let's just say they were given nothing that could have zero effect on the virus. With their unfilled promises flushed down the drain, more than 1,000 newborns contracted HIV/AIDS, which could be avoided if their mothers were given the AZT drug. Conclusion. Although the manner in which some scientific data was obtained was ruthless to the core, little to nothing was done to the culprit. Instead, they were encouraged, just as the US gave asylum to the Nazis, and also the Unit 731 Japanese doctors in exchange for their scientific knowledge.